So I had a recent conversation. I did not cut my hair, by the way. I'm looking at the camera now, and I'm like, I tied my hair back, and it looks like I cut my hair off. I did not cut my hair off. Uh, um, I had a recent conversation, and I thought it was really interesting the way it went. And so I thought I would share this on YouTube, just really briefly. And maybe it'll make sense of some of the things I've been talking about concerning worldview, Christianity, post Christian culture, and why I was so convinced to go another way. All right, now, if you follow any of my content, you know that I was involved in Christian ministry. I taught Christian apologetics. I was really, really into offering arguments and evidence for why Christianity was true. And then later in life, I decided to convert to Zoroastrianism. Okay. So, in this recent conversation I had, I noticed, and this is a commonality I've seen, that when I tell people about my younger years, when I was a teenager, young adult, early 20s, I'm like 31, I'll be 32 this year. When I tell them about my younger years and the experience I had therein, I often find that they are quite baffled. And what I mean is that, well, what typifies a young teenager's life? In our culture, we have grown up believing that teenagers sort of have their own way of just going off the rails. They get crazy because really we're suppressing these debauched tendencies to just do the absolute worst possible things. Now, that very well could be true for some teenagers. I know in my teenage experience that was true for a lot of different people. However, I don't think, and this is the conversation I had following talking about my teenagers, I don't think that that is exactly what typifies every teenager. And so, first and foremost, what I wanted to do was to talk about how I don't think it is our common experience that original sin, total depravity, or any of these dogmas that suggest that humans are by nature evil seems to be true. I think that there could be a general argument to say that not all people are equal. That seems to be very true, and that some people are worse than others, and that there actually are paragons of virtue out there who are just born with the disposition to do good. And that's oftentimes the conversations I have about my teenage, young life, etc., etc., when I'm telling people that at 8 years of age, I was really concerned about justice. I was concerned about doing the right thing. And I was really, really conscious bound about every action I took. I give stories all the time to my high school students about situations I found myself in where I made the right decision, even though I knew it might find me social seclusion or ostracization. Can't ever say that word correctly. But basically, I would be secluded from peers or made fun of or whatever. And I was a pretty popular dude when I was in high school. I'm sure if you watched this and you knew me in high school, I mean, it wasn't like I was some secluded hermit. You know, like I was pretty well known, depending on which high school you remember me from. Or if you never knew me in my younger years, well, now you kind of know. But typically what typified my high school experience was that I was just so dead set on being noble and good. And I carried that into my early adult years. And what I suggested to this person, because I was engaging with someone who basically suggested, look, you sounds like you just never had the typical teenage life where you kind of went off the rails, is that I think that that's really just a cultural zeitgeist. I think that's just a myth. And I think that is propagated and held up by our previous Christian convictions. We live in a post-Christian world, and because of that, we live with some of the fallout of Christian mythos, Christian theology, Christian philosophy, Christian worldview. And one specific one that I just talked about was this idea that by nature we are sinners, evil, bad. And so no matter what, at bottom, like Martin Luther thought, we're just a worm, right? We're bad. And we really can't do anything good of our own accord. That just simply seems patently false. By intuition, it just does not seem to be the case. And I think that, for me, right, Christianity did not describe in very good detail what my teenage life was like or my early adult years were like. They were not typified by constant mistake making, which, by the way, we always talk about making mistakes and then sins as if they're one thing. They are radically different. It is not a mistake to be given to a debauched life, right? That's actively doing the wrong thing. A mistake would be to do something you didn't mean to do, right? Oftentimes I think we say that here in the West, like, oh, it was a mistake. Well, no, you meant to do it. So it's not a mistake. You're just a bad person. Sorry. But I think that Christianity was so distant from my real world experience that many times throughout my younger years, I was I found myself with the question mark above my head whenever I would engage with Christians and I would talk about my life, and they're just like, "Yeah, but what's your testimony? Like, what did Jesus save you from?" And I'm like, I don't know. And they're just like, "It's pride. It's pride, because you think you lived a good life, and you clearly haven't, because we're by nature all sinners and evil." If that narrative for you doesn't sit so well, right? It certainly didn't for me. Well, I've got good news. I do think that this whole notion about our disposition as teenagers or young adults or whatever, uh, I think that this entire notion, this entire narrative, is just bankrupt. Again, I don't think it fits very well with our experience of the real world, especially, say, someone like myself that did not typify my experience. I think that oftentimes when we have this sort of universalizing for everyone, obviously we know, we all went to grade school, we know that it typically just falls through, falls flat. Um, but also, I think there are better narratives out there that describe our real experience. And I think, probably, and I find myself going backward quite a lot, the best explanation of our real world experience comes from the philosopher prophet Zarathustra, who wrote in the Gathas. This is sort of the typological centerpiece of all theology, of Zoroastrianism. That really, what it is that people start with two paths before them, and they make a choice between the path of truth or the path of the lie, the path of evil, the path of good. They choose to serve God or evil. And I think that this binary has become so on the nose for people that we've grown to reject it, and we think that life is just radically more complex than that. But that doesn't seem to be really the case from my experience or most of the people I talk to. It just seems like we're too afraid to say, hey, that person acts this way routinely, and that is his character, and he is bad. And I think that we oftentimes are cautious to say that, well, that person's character is typified by noble actions. When I'm around them, I feel a sense of elevation. They seem like a really good person, right? And we do see, I think, if we would speak to it, I think we see people like that on all sides of religion and politics and so on and so forth, not just throughout history, but even in the modern day. And I think that if I didn't believe that particular narrative myself, it would be very difficult to strive after being excellent, when knowing at the end of the day your actions really amount to not. But I think that's the beauty of Zoroastrianism, is that it presents at the forefront that it acknowledges good and evil are objectively real things, not evil as a privation of the good, but that evil is an objectively real thing, and we experience that day to day, and that there really are good and bad people, and that this sort of binary way of thinking that we have, well, it's for a reason, and that even though there might be gray areas, well, it's only gray in retrospect to the fact that there are black and white, good and evil. There's a binary, right? And so I wanted to bring that conversation to YouTube because I thought it was really interesting that for a majority of the people I talk to, they talk about their past life, and it's usually pretty rough. Most people tell me they lived however they wanted. And I think that this sort of I went crazy in my youth, lived however I wanted, and now I'm living, whatever. I think that is just simply a byproduct of Christianity. And I think that as we move away from Christianity, especially here in the West, we might benefit from, as I've said in the past, adopting new narratives. And I know that's very difficult. Our worldviews are so molded not by what we choose to mold it by, but the outside forces that really mold it to be, right? But for me, that's something I've tried to unlearn, relearn, is that these intuitive notions about good and evil that I have may actually just be the case, and that this sort of overlaid Christian counterintuitive worldview I had, where everyone is just by nature evil, and that there really just is no good works or anything like that. I think that that's just bogus. And so, of course, in conversations I have with people, I try to bring that out. I try to bring out this whole notion, especially for people who say that and are not Christians, right? They're just buying into a greater narrative that they themselves reject. I just think that Um, this entire net, we have almost conditioned ourselves to see ourselves as evil and bad. And because of that, we've spoken into existence. In large part, I think that's why you see, like, because I was raised in the South. The South is primarily dominated by Southern or Protestants, and Protestantism is again probably the front runner here of teaching that on the worst end that we're totally depraved if you're more reformed, or on the lighter end there's at least this notion of original sin to where all of our actions and intentions are all sort of geared towards evil. And so if you view yourself that way, well, then by consequence, you're going to act in a certain way. But I think if we move away from viewing the world that way, and I think that's very much why I didn't act the same way as everyone else. I wasn't from the forefront taught that I was evil and sinful and that all my actions were equated to really not. And I wasn't fed the worldview that humans are by nature sinners. I think that in major part, because I wasn't fed that, I didn't feed into it. And I think that Zoroastrianism offers us a very vibrant and bright worldview, where not only is God depicted in the way I think Christians really want God to be depicted. I mean, oftentimes you hear Christians describe God, or even read some of my comments on YouTube. People will tell me to repent and worship Jesus or worship Yahweh, and I'm like, I don't want to worship a God who slaughters children or kills innocent people in place of the wicked. And they're like, what God does that? And I'm like, are you not reading the Bible? Like, that's the Christian God. That's what he does par excellence. That's his whole shtick, right? It's like, but in Zoroastrianism, you don't get God in that. Like, God is absolutely wholesome, like excellent. Look at the relationship God has to the people that he engages with, specifically Ahura Mazda. There's several gods in Zoroastrianism, but specifically Ahura Mazda. You're not going to get any more wholesome a God. And of course, the worldview perspective that comes out of Zoroastrianism is so radically intuitive. Why reject it? And so, again, just a conversation I had recently, but maybe even a little bit of pushback to some of my commenters on some of my videos who just seem so zealous to say that one should just repent and believe on Jesus, or just repent and come back to Christianity. I found something greater. And my encouragement would be for you to maybe dig a little deeper, and maybe you could have a piece of the just of how wonderful the Zoroastrian worldview is. And maybe in time, maybe your children or your children's children can hopefully, as I hope for mine, can abandon this just absolutely morally bankrupt worldview that teaches us from the outset that we're just wicked and evil, and by consequence we act wicked and evil, and then we all act shocked that humans act wicked and evil. And then of course the same worldview that tells good people that they're not really good, and so the very little bit of light that's in the world, we just kind of crush it out. I think that Zoroastrianism can preserve that, and it can make those little lights, to use a little bit of religious imagery, a burning fire for everyone else to draw near to and feel elevation from. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, especially when it comes to the psychological impact of worldview. I know for some Christians you're going to say that you don't buy into some of this stuff, or maybe that I was a little too heavy-handed with it, but I know for a lot of you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So